All right, minasan, yokoso e. Today we'll be discussing how to draft initial claims in a software patent application. 今日も日本語をあまり話しません。英語で、今日も英語でだけです。すみません。All right. So today we'll discuss how and when do we write claims for a new patent application. We'll talk about the content of an independent claim, and then we'll talk about the content of a dependent claim. So the process typically begins by the inventors providing a written explanation of their invention. This practice is highly recommended because it can establish a date on which the invention was conceived. Okay, it's not as important as it used to be, but it's still important. Also, we want a thoughtful explanation of the invention. People tend to be more thoughtful in writing than in spoken communication. Have I received invention disclosures only spoken? Yes. But I end up spending a significant amount of time making sure that all of the aspects that are necessary to produce the inventive effect are reflected in the application, right? People are less formal when they speak, and so we have to be more careful when we track all of the data across the many operations of the software. And therefore, ideally, these explanations include a flowchart or signal diagram. Why? Well, computers execute processes and humans explain processes via flowcharts and signal diagrams. Um, to be honest, it's really difficult for me to understand a typical Japanese software application, patent application that only shows the flow of data via modules. If there's no flowchart, I have to write in the data as it flows through the modules to understand how the process is performed, how the program executes. And that's reflected in American patent law, right? I mean, that's our law is that we prefer flowcharts. So today's topic would be very difficult unless I give you an example. So here is an example invention disclosure. A friend mentioned this to me the other day as a potential idea, not a engineer friend, just kind of like a, hey, this is something that should exist. So I have no idea if this is out there. I have no idea, that this is just something my friend suggested. In the United States, customers at gasoline stands pump their own gasoline, right? In Japan, for example, people, gasoline stand employees pump gas for the customers. In the United States, they generally do not do that for us. Pardon me. It still occurs in some places like New Jersey, but I haven't had my gas pumped for me in God, like 20 years probably. Customers are often bored while we wait for the gas um, to fill up our car. And so many gasoline pumps incorporate a digital screen to provide information, toka, show advertisements, toka, while customers wait. On the other hand, visual civic information, such as photographs of missing children or wanted criminals, is displayed in American post offices. Demo, Saikin, we don't visit the post office so often, right? Like I go maybe twice a year, and that's probably a lot for most Americans. And so this civic information is not being seen. So the invention is modifying the digital screens at a gasoline stand to show a picture of a criminal or a child. We'll call it a person of interest instead of advertisements. And to improve the relevance of the person of interest, we're going to determine the pictures on a location basis, right? We're going to show the picture based on a last known sighting of the person of interest. Hey, maybe they were seen in Washington, D.C. last week. That's a good place to show the photo. Maybe don't show it in Hawaii. Um, or where their hometown, maybe, or a location of a crime that they committed. Something, it's location based. What's your on? The location basis can be the location of the gasoline stand, right? That just is intuitive. But first, I have to explain another cultural point about the United States. When we use our credit cards, frequently we don't use a PIN number associated with it. Instead, we validate the card using a postal code. The postal code of the location to which the bill for the credit card is sent. And so the location basis, so we're punching, we enter the postal code into the gasoline pump to validate the card. And then the location basis for our invention can be based on this postal code now. And so the person of interest can be relevant to the particular customer. This also makes sense because people use gasoline stands while traveling. If I travel from Washington, D.C. to Florida, maybe I stop for gas in Atlanta, Georgia. Yes, it makes sense to show me people who were seen in Atlanta, Georgia, but it also makes sense to show me people in Washington because I'm not in Atlanta, Georgia for very long. I'm only in Atlanta for 30 minutes. So it can be based on my personal postal code. So once we have this invention disclosure, the first thing we're going to do is make a flowchart to just organize how the invention works. Hopefully we receive this from the inventor, but if not, we make it ourselves. So you can see on the right side of the slide, first we receive the credit card number, right? We put our card into the machine. We validate it using the postal code. This is very normal. The gasoline pump transmits an ID for the gasoline stand or pump, a credit card number, and the postal code, right? We have to know which gasoline stand to send the data to. The server determines whether the postal code is valid for the credit card number. It retrieves the photograph for a postal code, and it transmits the photograph based on the stand ID. And then eventually the gasoline pump displays the photograph. This is kind of the overall flow, right? I mean, if we don't need to perform the validation if the postal code that we're using is just the gasoline pump. So in order to write a claim, we have to know what we're claiming, right? So what are we claiming? Well, we could claim the system, including the server and the gasoline pump. But then proving patent infringement might be difficult. For example, we would want to prove that one entity controls both the server and the gasoline pump. That is unlikely in the year 2025, right? The server is probably some regional service provider that, validates credit cards and provides data. The gasoline stand is probably completely independent. It sells gas and just happens to send data there. Okay, well, maybe we want to claim the gasoline pump, right? That's where the customer interacts with the invention. However, the gasoline pump does not perform any new actions, right? For example, it already transmits credit card numbers and postal codes. It already displays data that it receives. So we claim the enhanced element, which in this case is the server. How do we do that? Well, if we have the signal diagram, we literally draw a box around it. Now we claim the important operations in this box. Okay, so we're not going to claim these things that occur at the gasoline pump, right? Displaying the photograph. We're not going to claim receiving this information. We can claim it here, right? If we say receive credit card number and postal code, that's okay. This is where it's received. And we can say transmitting the photograph because this is where it's transmitted. But we don't want to claim anything that occurs outside of the box. Well, how do we do that? Well, there's a lot of different strategies. Some people, well, of course, we all want broad claims. And so some people recite the invention very broadly. Tatoeba, a method for a server comprising receiving information related to a commercial transaction and transmitting content for a particular customer based on the information. Okay. Under US practice, we interpret these claims very broadly. This claim does not distinguish over the prior art, advertisements at gasoline stands, right? You begin a transaction, it sends some sort of information, and then it transmits the advertisement to the customer based on whatever, that the gas has started flowing, right? That could be the information. Or maybe the information is an initial registration, right? We're going to begin serving uh, uh, advertisements at this gasoline stand. So please start sending us data. Maybe that's related to a commercial transaction. The particular customer can be anyone standing at the gasoline stand, right? Any customer. These terms aren't defined in the claim. Maybe they're defined in the specification, but again, in America, we don't really consider the specification as much as in other jurisdictions. Okay, well, sometimes people try to avoid these interpretations by claiming only the invention, right? They do not claim anything more than the exact point of novelty. These overly generic claims, like on this slide, occur like, 90% of the time. Maybe 10% of the time, we see these overly specific claims that are basically just the point of novelty. It's the tokuchotosuru, and it looks like this. A method for a server comprising transmitting a photograph of a person of interest for display to a particular customer at a gasoline stand. This is the wrong scope of claim. Okay. Sometimes, people have um, well, what's the right word for it? People have a very um, straightforward understanding of broad or narrow. But actually, they're not different. The same claim can be both broad and narrow, right? It's a question of scope. It's not just always broad or always narrow. Maybe it's broad here and very narrow over here. And that's this claim. Okay. There's only a single step of transmitting. So it's very broad in that sense. It's very narrow in the sense of it's a photograph of a person of interest and it's going to be displayed to a particular customer and it's not anywhere. It's got to be at a gasoline stand. Like it's a little narrow in that regard. But because of its breadth, a U.S. examiner can easily reject such a claim as obvious. Tatoeba, maybe a reference teaches transmitting a photograph of a person of interest. Of course, that's out there. There's tons of photographs of people transmitted every day. And if your second reference teaches displaying information to a customer at a gasoline stand, right, like happens with advertisements, it's going to be very easy for your examiner to combine those two references to reach this claim. Okay, this is actually a very broad claim in some respects, but it's also very specific in terms of what it's claiming and the way it claims it. So what's a good claim one? What's a balanced claim one? Well, it looks like this. We receive transaction data, including an identifier of a retail outlet. We retrieve a photograph based on a geographic location associated with the transaction data, and then we transmit the photograph based on the identifier of the retail outlet. People ask me all the time, Brian, you say such negative things about associated with. Is it correct that you never use it? No, I frequently use it, especially in original claim one, not just this one, in the applications I draft. It's a good way to claim something broadly, but I know that I will probably get a rejection, but I want to see what rejection I get. I want to see what art the examiner gives me. I want to see what the grounds for rejection are. So it's fine to use associated with here. And again, I apologize. This isn't the greatest claim in the world. It's also probably not the greatest example. You know, sumimasen. If we read this claim, what makes this claim good? If we read the claim, we can draw something like that was shown in the box. I think it's on slide 9. Okay. It doesn't need to be all of the details that occur in the red box. It can look different than the details of the box, right? But it has enough that we can draw something like that, and it should have produce an inventive effect over the prior art, right? Now we can understand, okay, yes, transmitting the photograph based on the or I'm sorry, that the photograph is retrieved based on a geographic location. That's the distinction over the prior art. That's what makes it different. You know, the claim is not too generic, right? It effectively defines commercial transaction. Well, which one? It's the one with the retail outlet. Okay. It effectively defines particular customer. Which one? The one at the retail outlet. It's not somebody walking around the super. It's not somebody at the depato. It's got to be something about this retail outlet. Again, not the greatest claim. It's also not too specific, right? It contains only the minimum necessary to produce the inventive effect. So how is this different than the overly specific one? We don't rely on a display. We only transmit the photograph. We don't have to display it. And does the other one require displaying? Well, it depends on what happens when you enforce it, right? I know maybe the applicant thinks it doesn't require a display, but your competitor will choose, your accused infringer will choose whether or not it's advantageous to them to argue whether the display is there or not. We're not relying on some special definition of a person of interest. We're not relying on a special definition of a particular customer, right? Everything's in the claim. It's still very broad. Again, this when I give my seminars, um, or when American attorneys generally give seminars, we are very hesitant to tell people what to do because we want to be 100% accurate. We don't want people to misinterpret what we say, especially when there is some form of language barrier. But I've realized that people really want me to just tell them what to do. They know that it depends. They know there will be certain, special circumstances. They just want guidelines. They don't want absolute rules. So with that in mind, I don't know your particular case. I've done cases that follow these. I've done cases that don't follow these. The general rules are that an independent claim for a software invention should have at least 3 steps. Okay. The first step is usually data gathering. What data do we need? Okay. Or we're going to define it somehow. Does it come from a particular location? Does it have a particular format? Does it have a particular content? What data do we base our process on? The second element is data processing. What do we do with the gathered data? Okay, we've got it. What are we doing? What is the inventive aspect that we're actually performing on this data, right? The data is known, the processing is new. And then step three, and this is particularly important after Alice, is data output. How do we use the result of the processing, right? Again, this step, sometimes the steps in a dependent claim. Um, but typically you have to do something with it. You have to transmit it somewhere, you have to display it somewhere, you have to, whatever it is. Let me give you an exception. This week I drafted a claim one that included 6 steps. Okay. It was rare, but it was necessary to distinguish over very crowded prior art. I had 2 different receiving steps at the beginning because they came from different locations. Maybe they could be combined, but mine had 6 steps. Um, that's a lot. Sometimes I use more. 3 is pretty much the minimum. Most independent claims have like 4 or 5, probably more like 4 steps to them. Okay, what about dependent claims? Well, they play a lot of different roles, right? まずは、客様は神様です。そうして、one role for dependent claims is just satisfying inventors or in-house counsel. There are many times that an inventor says, I really want a claim to cover this aspect, or in-house counsel has some sort of goal. Maybe it's a business goal or just a different understanding of the invention, and they'll ask for a feature. We try to protect the independent claim from it, right? We want the independent claim to be broad, but it's very easy to use a dependent claim for this purpose, and it's good customer service. Dependent claims can be used to cover different embodiments. They can provide basis for things like claim differentiation. There's all sorts of different uses for dependent claims. On the other hand, many patent offices, USPTO, TOCA, JPO, TOCA, EPO, TOCA, charge official fees based on the number of dependent claims. And so my point is we tend to be more flexible with dependent claims, right? There's not really any rule because the rule depends on the use. And the use depends on what the applicant is willing to pay. Brian, just tell me what to do. Okay, just like many Benrishi, I want my dependent claims to establish an inventive effect. Mine look a little bit different, but I think that's the best use because there are so few, because they incur fees. Brian, just tell me what to do. Claim two, um, I want to take a quick aside. When I do these seminars, I think about it as if I'm receiving a seminar from a European attorney because the European attorneys, we share kind of this Western culture, and they are also very hesitant to just tell me what to do. And this is what I want from them. That's why I'm laughing, is because when I present, I don't want to tell people what to do. But when I attend, when I receive the seminar, it's just tell me what to do. So it's claim two, the transaction. Oh, I'm sorry. So my dependent claim, I'm going to begin at the bottom actually. My dependent claims have 2 features, usually, not usually, often. I introduce a structure in red, and then I explain its purpose in green. 例えば, claim two, the transaction data includes a postal code. I'm defining what the postal code is, or what the transaction data is, more accurately. I'm defining the transaction data, and then I tell you by including the postal code, and then I tell you what the use of the purpose of the postal code is. It's the basis for retrieving the photograph. Claim three depends from claim two, further defining the transaction data. Now it also includes a credit card number. Brian, what's the purpose of the credit card number? It's something that's validated based on the postal code. Okay. These are great claims for American prosecution. I can't stress that enough. Maybe this seems obvious. Maybe this is not something that would be used in a different country. For us, you're like, okay, the transaction data now has the gasoline stand ID, it has the postal code, it has a credit card number. There's a certain relationship between all of the different aspects. Now I understand how to draw everything in the red box. Claim four, sometimes my dependent claims only have one feature. What's an example of that? Here I'm determining the geographic location based on the identifier of the gasoline stand, right? We have two different embodiments. One where it's based on the location of the gasoline stand, one where it's based on the postal code entered by the customer. So, to sum up, how and when do we write software claims? After developing or receiving an initial flowchart, we draft the initial claims. Generally speaking, this is an iterative process with drafting the initial flowcharts, right? What do I mean by that? Well, after we draft our claims, because maybe somebody gave us the flowchart, we update the flowchart with any additional information. Maybe we need to give things different names, maybe we need to move the order, whatever. And then we make other changes, right? Oh, okay, this needs to move down, and this is actually two steps, and this is a different embodiment, and this is optional. Then we have to update our claims again, right? If it's optional, it should move down from the independent claim to a dependent claim. Maybe this, part of the step stays in the independent claim and something gets moved down to the dependent claim. Maybe we're like, oh, we're not claiming the invention anymore. We need to move something from a dependent claim up to the independent claim. We update our claims again. And then we go back to the flowcharts. This process for me is very common. It often takes like 8 hours of work. This is most of it though. I mean, once you're done with this, you just copy those claims into your specification and draft around it. You reorder them, right? Of course. I mean, the order in the claims is not the order of um, the steps in the flowchart. But this is, you're like 20% done with the application at that point. What is the content of a typical independent claim? It's usually like 4 or 5 elements. Six is kind of a lot. Three is kind of the minimum. Ideally, we can do it in three, but again, we're probably going to get a rejection. And what's the content of a dependent claim? It's usually one or two features that produce an inventive effect. I'm Brian Epstein. Um, please let me know if you have any questions or comments. You can see us on YouTube. This is how you can reach me. ありがとうございます。